evening, ladies, gentlemen, citizens, citizenesses. Quite a few of you have not been here today. I can tell we keep everybody under surveillance. And so I want to welcome you to the University of Sydney. I want to welcome you to the final session of our third annual Festival of Democracy, hosted by the Sydney Democracy Network, which is the first of its kind in Australia. We think it's got great potential. It's a network of scholars worrying their heads about present and future of democracy, as well as activists, as well as organization people. And this festival is one of the highlights of our year. Our subject tonight is fitting, I think, because more than a few of us feel quite a lot of despair about things that are going on locally and in the world. I've always thought that when you look into the things of our world at the moment, it's understandable that one feels despair. But I've also thought that there's no such thing, and here it's Haruki Murakami who reminds us that there's no such thing as perfect despair. For a start, when you despair, actually you still believe that things can be better. There are things worse than despair. And I've also thought that the difference between hope and despair is that the same facts can be told differently. You can narrate things differently, and things change. And I think that we have tonight two guests who are going to speak to us who know the arts of changing narratives, who defied the day as it was set out for them, as we say. One of them is Scott Ludlam, and I'd like warmly to welcome you, Scott, to SDN and to the university. I first met you in either Darlinghurst or Surrey Hills, and we got off to a very bad start. I had never met you. I was nervous, and I said sarcastically, because you didn't know me, but it's my nature, "Senator Ludlam." And you looked at me and said, "Don't ever call me that." And I thought that was very cool. Here was a senator, a politician with a difference, someone with a sense of humor, humility, great intelligence, great decency, a representative, an elected representative who is willing to sleep rough with people on the streets because he takes housing and youth and marginalization seriously. Someone who it's been told to be by more than a few people who is the only politician who made them a cup of tea. This is not a very good beginning for for puffing up a senator, but I think these stories are important and they help explain why actually Scott Ludlam is among the most talked about and revered and loved politicians in this country. You know that he was elected in November 2007 to the Australian Greens, a senator for Western Australia. He's currently co-deputy of the Australian Greens. There are altogether 11 members, and in your absence, Scott, George Newhouse this afternoon praised the senators probably the last point of resistance to tyranny in this country, because we don't have a Bill of Rights and the Constitution is pretty manky, and the political class are not especially, let's say, up to speed. You are currently learning lots about foreign affairs. You are the spokesperson for foreign affairs plus communications, housing, in which you've had a long-standing interest, nuclear issues, and sustainable cities. You've made films. You are by profession, once upon a time, a graphic designer, and pretty vigorous in the field of social media. A very warm welcome to you. What's going to happen in a few minutes at quarter to six exactly is that we're going to jump cut to the Ecuador embassy, where there is another man who knows about despair and also who knows about the arts of defiance. We're living, as we all know, in the age of total surveillance, in which digital dissent is happening, and where digital asylum seeking is, let's say, a flourishing trade. There are lots of digital asylum seekers and those in trouble. Manning Brown is among those about whom too little is known, and we know from The Intercept that there's another big leak that's happening. But it does seem, I think, to all of us that Julian Assange deserves a reputation as perhaps the first great one who did something pretty amazing. He will join us at 5:45. It is about 6:30 or so in the morning in London. I don't need to say much more about Julian Assange, except that I do want to say a few words about the conditions in which he's living. I've discovered, when we put him on the program in recent weeks, that many people think that life in the Ecuador embassy, where I've been 5 times now, is a kind of holiday. You know, there must be a nice garden and a fountain and so on. It's not like that at all. He lives in a very tiny room. It's airless, there's no sun, and this is, as you know from the program, his 1216th day in sight. So, Despair, Defiance, Scott.
I've never been introduced like that before. I have no idea how to live up to an intro like that, apart from offering to make you all a cup of tea. It sounds like it's been an amazing couple of days. I'm going to go through some thoughts on that theme of despair and defiance. Some of it is stuff that I wrote this afternoon. Some of it's from... I keep a journal occasionally, very occasionally, and I take a little bit of a risk in a couple of minutes and read you some of that stuff. We should start, as we regularly do, is by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country that we're meeting on. So, in this town, we'll acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional sovereign people of this country, whose despair might be acknowledged, but whose defiance actually to this day is a story that has not been well told. I think a more progressive reading of Australian history might allow for the existence... Sorry, you will be. Who is that? Siri, how do I turn my phone to silent? I'm just going to check mine. Okay. So a more progressive reading of Australian history might acknowledge and allow for the existence of the frontier wars, but not steer too close to the consequences, the present-day consequences of that. Or acknowledge the present-day processes of dispossession, which are driven much more by global commodity prices, real estate markets, mining legislation, than by musket balls and infected blankets. But the effect is much the same, and the effect is of landscapes that have been cleared out of people. And my entry into this story wasn't until 1998, and it was at the invitation of the Mirror people of Kakadu National Park, whose very, very long and old custodianship of a place called Jabiluka was effectively about to come to an end in 1998. And they invited the greenies around the country to come and help them out, to assist them. And it was my introduction into what I thought was an environmental campaign, like a traditional greenie campaign, which up close turned out to be much more complex and much more a campaign about land rights and about the ability of sovereign people to decide what happened on their land. Jabiluka happens to be one of the last high-grade uranium deposits in the world. The Mirror stories of that place, and I can assure you I didn't come here tonight to speak for them, the stories of that place, as they told us, are all about guardianship and warning, about not disturbing the escarpment and what lies under it, because it would be ruinous for them, but the stories also go, it would be extremely damaging, harmful and risky for people all around the world. The present-day custodian is a woman called Yvonne Margarula, who's a remarkable individual. Her father, Tony Gangali, drank himself to death after being coerced into signing the Ranger mineral lease. I just spotted Helen Caldecott up the back. Hello. Somebody who knows this story better than I do. coerced into signing the Ranger mineral lease in Kakadu during the government of Malcolm Fraser, and died of despair, an individual who effectively was dispossessed. They gave him the pen after they forced him to sign the Ranger agreement that set up the Ranger mineral lease, the Jabiluka mineral lease, and the Kungara mineral lease. Kungara has just gone back into Kakadu National Park and will never be mined, principally because of the work of a senior elder and a custodian, Geoffrey Lee, who spoke and still speaks out very strongly for that place, and who effectively gave up the offer of a blank cheque by Arriva, the French nuclear conglomerate, said he wanted his country and that was more important to him. That's gone back into the park. That's now been reincorporated into the World Heritage Area. The Ranger mineral lease, or the Ranger mine, the operation up there is on its knees. You might have heard late last year, almost a year ago, I guess, the failure of a leach tank up there. The mine is old, it's crapped out. They've nearly exhausted the deposit up there. Jabiluka is one of the last high-grade uranium deposits in the world, and this is my first entry into a story of defiance in the real world, where Yvonne, her family, and a collection of greenies took on the NT government, the federal government, Howard government at the time, that was proposing to open up 25 uranium mines, and one outstretched tentacle of the global nuclear industry, and they won. They won by standing up for themselves. They fought it politically, they fought it legally, they fought it by putting their bodies in the way, they fought it by a process of non-violent direct action, and they prevailed. And that was a campaign led by a very strong Aboriginal woman, and where foot soldiers like me turned up at the blockade just outside of Jabiru, they gave us a passport, said, you're on Aboriginal country now, you're welcome here, as long as you play by these rules, and if you don't, and if you screw up, you're out. And they threw people out, probably not as many as they'd have liked to, actually. They did send people home if they screwed up and if they didn't play by the rules, and it was profoundly moving for me as somebody who lived in Australia since I was 8 years old, and it wouldn't have been to my mid-20s that I learnt the name of the traditional mob who've occupied the Swan River area where the Swan River colony was established in 1829 for 40,000 years. Hadn't heard the word Noongar until I was in my mid-20s. It was profoundly important to be issued with an immigration document for arriving on country in 1998 and being told that if I played by the rules, I'd be very welcome to stay there. These campaigns aren't always a success. Young people from all over the country, small handful of Aboriginal elders, Greenie campaigners, were locked into a shipping container on the Beverley mineral lease where they tried to step up and take the same kind of action, pepper sprayed, and then had the door of the shipping container slammed on them by the South Australian Staff Force Police. And then Heathgate were legally allowed to inject very strong acidic leachate into the groundwater under Beverley uranium deposit and supply a few meagre thousand tonnes of uranium into the global nuclear fuel chain. So these things don't always end well, and you can't always tell in advance what's going to be the Jabiluka campaign and what will be the Beverley one. And when I was reflecting on what to kind of bring to you today, because having a bit of a look at your program, you've had some extraordinary people sitting down here. I feel quite honoured to have been invited to take part. How much simpler it is when the adversary is bold enough or careless enough to break cover and move out into the open and take the mask off, so to speak. So having ERA, the mining company, have them get the Northern Territory Police to arrest Yvonne Margarula on her own country, on her own ancestral land, having her arrested for trespass. That's the enemy moving out into the open. That's kind of what I mean. That's what our elders would have called a teachable moment. Having Tony Abbott appoint himself the Minister for Women and sacking everybody with the word climate on their business card, that's the adversary moving out into the open, and how much easier our work is when they're careless enough to do that. But tonight I thought it might be worth considering concepts of despair and defiance when the mask goes back on. And so now for something completely different. Abbott, the onion guy, finished off. Let's just pause and think on that for a second. Fucker. Finished off by... Sorry, that was a bit undisciplined, wasn't it? I just said what you're all thinking. finished off by internal revulsion, coupled with polling reflecting many, many months of external popular revulsion. His own party doing what many of us covertly hoped that the electorate would be given the respect of doing in about a year's time. And feeling that myself as quite a personal shock, staggering in the same way as you stagger when something that you've been leaning on and pressed against actually quite aggressively for a period of time is suddenly taken away. You know, you're leaning on this thing and suddenly it's not there. And that was kind of how I experienced it, and realising quite uncomfortably a couple of days later that a lot of, I don't know how many of you felt this way, but that a lot of my political identity had become bound up in opposition to this conveniently pure expression of everything that I loathe, and that his abrupt departure sort of set the internal compass needle spinning a little bit, which is more than a little problematic when you think about it, because now the smooth Tory is going to do us all slowly. Okay, general nods. All right, so it's not just me. That's good. And there will be concessions, right? And some of them will be very important, because one thing Mr. Malcolm Turnbull is not is stupid. And so for all the talk of Mr. Turnbull having pre-sold his own political views and some of his heart views at very heavily discounted rates to the National Party and the engorged and fevered ranks of the LNP backbench, he knows enough to give ground to a jaded and desperately hopeful electorate that the nightmare of shirt frontery hung with an aftertaste of onion might at last all be gone. And so we will fight for these moments of slippage and concession, or good faith negotiations if they're offered up, because in this business you take your wins where you can get them. But not to forget that from here on we're as a movement, if I can dignify us with that vague and all-encompassing term, we're contending on much more complex terrain. There won't be 3-word slogans, I don't think, but there will be subtle and self-evident sophistry backed by very carefully reasoned arguments that lead us somehow to a future almost immediately adjacent to the one that we were heading for before. As we gather here this afternoon, as a woman, a young Somali woman who was raped on Peter Dutton's prison island, who sought our assistance in coming to this country in the first place, fleeing a place that has simply disintegrated under successive waves of violence, sought safe harbour in Australia as is her right under international law, was raped in our care, and sought for weeks a termination and medical assistance. And here's some defiance. George Newhouse basically seizing the moment. 60,000 people signed his petition in a matter of a day or two. And she was brought here. And last night she was deported again because she wanted to see a counsellor. She's now 14 weeks pregnant. She wanted to see a counsellor. She's been deported. She is probably now back in Nauru. I cannot imagine what she has just gone through. She's back on the island where she was raped in our care. And Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull is going to have to own that. That is not something that we can branch back to the ditch the witch guy. That happened on his watch, but that happened collectively on our watch as well. And the problem for us maybe collectively is that the best way to collapse a movement is to tell the people that they won. And so in this regard, I think we need to take a good hard look at what it was that we were opposing. Were we opposing Tony Abbott, or were we opposing child sexual abuse in the concentration camps that we've subcontracted to Transfield and Serco and others? Or were we opposing Abbott, or were we opposing the disemboweling of the Bowen Basin, which I think would be the 7th largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world if it was a country and if it was mined out? Were we opposing Abbott, or were we opposing the next wave of Aboriginal dispossession, or the structural magnifiers of inequality that have been very carefully written into our tax system by people who knew exactly what they were doing? And Abbott obviously embodied the perfect cipher for everything gone rancid in our national character, but if we imagine that the political self-interest of marginally more than half of his party room colleagues have averted the country from what's already been set in motion, then we're probably in for a bit of a shock. And the setup to me feels a bit more interesting now under Mr. Turnbull than just the same rotting agenda in a flash new box. I think it's more interesting than that, because it's entirely unlikely that the Greens are the only ones who figured this out. The Liberal Party room just turfed a first-term Prime Minister 2/3 of the way towards his electoral demolition at our hands. because on their reading of public opinion polls, Mr. Abbott was about to lead them right off a cliff. Yeah. And so the question for all of us, whether our politics are green or independent or agnostic or non-parliamentary, is this: the polls were telling us that. The question, I guess, that I want to put to us tonight, were those polls telling us that nationally, robocalls or Newspoll, whoever, were they picking up that we hated the swagger or the cheerful illiteracy or the excruciating opportunism or just that weird thing that he does with his tongue? Or were they telling us more that our expectations of basic fairness were being assaulted, that the subliminal imperatives of climate change can no longer be ignored, or that at heart we're actually a generous people who will offer safe harbour to desperate families as long as we're confident in our own basic security? Because if the latter is the case, then maybe the events of the last couple of weeks have lit a longer fuse, and that we're actually maybe on the way to genuinely getting our country back. I've been reading for years a lot of systems theory and can recommend it, particularly if it's well written. And a rather beautiful book that I just finished called Ubiquity, it's a couple of years old now, teaches us that the earthquake, when it begins, doesn't know how big it's going to be. Think on that. It's one of the reasons that earthquakes are basically inherently unpredictable. It doesn't matter how great your supercomputer is, you'll never be able to predict the earthquake, because the earthquake itself doesn't know when it starts, when that first tremor starts, doesn't actually know how big it's going to get. It might die out, leaving nothing more than an ephemeral glitch on the seismograph, or it might cascade and ramify until it reshapes an entire landscape and moves your country 3 feet to the left. So to maybe pick a less ruinous analogy, imagine that with enough irritating robocalls or patient telecentre queries, a critical mass of Australians told our polling companies that at the earliest opportunity, they intended to throw that shallow and vindictive excuse for a government under a bus, and that in order to prevent those tremors from growing into a real political earthquake, a slender majority of the Liberal Party room left the front man out in the middle of the road instead, at which point the seismographs sort of resume their background twitching. I think maybe you can see where this is going. So what that leaves me with is a reckless hope that maybe we don't lose the central lesson around what just happened, which is that, sure, it's just polling and we don't take them too seriously, except we do, that a statistical majority had indicated that had enough of the attacks on the common good and the violation of such unspoken social contract as exists in this fortunate part of the world, and that all that power is actually still there, not in the destructive sense of the earthquake to reshape the place. And so all I'm hoping really is that Australia isn't a cheap date, because there's so much more to lose. Is it too much to hope that we could ask for or hope for something more interesting than a stale oscillation between outright evil and mediocrity that just swings backwards and forwards every couple of years? Like, can we do better than that? And I get that Parliament is just the container for a very old and very dangerous argument, and that it's meant to be fractious and rowdy, and that's partly why you send us there. Is to settle very ancient disputes with words rather than machetes out in the street. But I'm often drawn back to an observation by Noam Chomsky, who said, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum. Does that sound a bit familiar? I wonder whether that might be some of the topics that you've been traversing over the last couple of days. So here are some unacceptable opinions of mine. That nation states and their contending national assemblies are now a basic part of the problem, particularly as we cede and outsource our legal authorities as parliaments to footloose capital, as we're just in the process of doing with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and its allied agreements around the world. The parliaments become less and less relevant. Parliament already doesn't decide whether we deploy the ADF back into Iraq to try and pour more petrol on the fire that we lit in 2003. And it soon won't be in a position to exercise a great deal of judgment calls on matters of international trade, because we will soon have put ourselves in the position where we can be sued by foreign capital. That advanced robotics are busily annihilating manual labour, and software that appears to be groping towards some form of distributed sentience is busy absorbing service sector professions about as rapidly. What does that mean for us? And that is the medium that we're using to build a global civil society, something that the our next guest knows quite a bit about, is also being thoroughly militarized or remilitarized. The military-industrial complex built the internet in the 1950s, and it appears to want it back. That's part of what I think we're seeing at the moment. I'll leave more perceptive comments on that matter to Julian in a few moments. But that it's now quite well established and maybe even a bit passé that 1% of the population holds the combined wealth of the rest of the 99% of us. And that extraordinary asymmetry is accelerating, and that it's bloody dangerous because when sinkholes open up in the world, as happened to the people of Syria who weren't actually doing anything wrong apart from just going about their lives, they'll flee. They'll take their families with them by the millions if necessary. I would. I'm reasonably sure that's what you would do as well. And do we actually believe that we spent 3.5 billion years evolving our way up from fucking slime just to collapse in an overheated surveillance dystopia in the present century? I mean, how boring. That's ridiculous. Against all possible odds, it feels as though something new is emerging. And the way Arundhati Roy put it a few years ago was, another world is not only possible, she's on her way, and on a quiet day I can hear her breathing. None of us, in my view, really have the luxury of despair about these things, but it is time to step up the defiance. And one person, this is where I'm nodding at Flick, who has spent years probing, mapping, and occasionally spraying graffiti on the world's hidden architectures is a Queenslander by the name of Julian Assange, who I think is going to join us reasonably soon. How are we doing for time?
We're bang on.
You totally lose track of time in a stream of consciousness rant like that. We're okay?
Yeah.
30, all right.
You do a filibuster for about 30 seconds.
That was my filibuster. Some people are hard to please. 3 minutes. I've run out of stuff to say. I don't know if you all still... Yeah, okay, we can take a question. That's a pretty decent idea.
Anybody? Despair?
First hand. Go.
Have you come across Joanna Macy and her despair and empowerment work?
Does it show?
Say a bit about that.
Yeah, she's a very important teacher of mine, and she spent quite a bit of time in WA. So for those quick show of hands, who's come across Joanna Macy? Yeah, a few in the room. So she is a Buddhist and a systems theorist and an anti-nuclear campaigner, and a remarkable woman who spent quite a bit of time in Australia, kind of between northern New South Wales and WA, teaching her work, which she was one of the proponents of deep ecology. Her particular branch of the work, which sort of melds Buddhism, systems theory, activism, politics, art, is called Despair and Empowerment. And yes, all right, so you've pinged me. Probably I should have acknowledged her as a teacher, which goes to some of these questions. He's up? Okay, brilliant. Of despair and how you work with that despair. Along the lines of, I forget, and I'll mangle this quote, that it is no sign of good health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. So own it, own that, and then get... I thoroughly recommend looking her up. So I believe we have a special guest. 1,216 days. That is bullshit. And I've visited him a couple of times in a very small embassy complex in Knightsbridge over the road from Harrods in London. And we tend to forget that he'd been under a period of house arrest, I think for nearly 2 years prior to that. Has never been charged with anything, but has certainly caused a world of discomfort for those who would prefer to keep those hidden architectures of the world secret. So please welcome by Skype all the way from London, Mr. Julian Assange. Thanks so much for joining us, and it's nice to see you. You've just published a book. Can you maybe... I managed to catch some of your interview with Fran Kelly earlier in the week, but you maybe want to go to... Here it is, the WikiLeaks files. How on earth have you had to publish that, and why had it not been published by somebody else already?
It wasn't published because the world is lame, really, really lame, and it's a surprising thing. We've produced 2.7 million US diplomatic cables now, beginning with the 251,000 that were famously published in 2010, 2011, and then going up every year by another few 100,000 and 500,000 this year. And that is the single largest compendium of primary source information about how the US empire works, the single largest compendium of diplomatic cables, foreign policy by the largest, most influential state the world has ever seen. So how can it be that that is not the source of thousands of academic articles? Well, actually, it is the source of thousands of academic articles, but thousands of academic articles in Spanish, in the Asian languages, in some German, Russian, and even in English, where it's concerning conflict epidemiology or computational linguistics, or a whole other whole range of technical fields and psychology and so on, but not where it concerns foreign policy, not where it concerns international relations, not where it concerns international politics. That was a real confounding mystery. The one academic field which should have this largest primary source repository as something that is central to the papers being produced wouldn't touch it. So yeah, the hypothesis was there's something strange about US and Anglo academia in foreign policy that keeps it away from US diplomatic cables and other materials published by WikiLeaks. And we tracked it down. There is in fact a policy by the largest foreign relations journals of never to publish a paper which has material by WikiLeaks, and there's an admission by the editor of one of the most influential international studies quarterly that they will never accept a paper that has WikiLeaks-derived materials in it, and that policy won't change until the umbrella organization, which publishes another number of other journals, changes its policy. And all that comes from a neo-McCarthyist hysteria that the West got into, especially in the United States, as a result of our publications, where the US government told every single US government employee and every single US government contractor in an email to them all that they should never read WikiLeaks materials, whether it's on our sites or whether indeed it's in the New York Times or Guardian or SMH, and added firewalls to the Department of Education, to the Library of Congress, to the US National Archives, to the Pentagon itself. It became so Kafkaesque that even emails that mentioned the word WikiLeaks were blocked by the Pentagon, so that the prosecution of the case against one of the alleged sources of the cables, Chelsea Manning, couldn't properly occur, and the judge and the prosecutor were emailing each other, and the emails were disappearing, and they had to start accounts outside of the Pentagon on regular email services in order to pursue the case. Anyway, it's a bizarre, quasi-religious world that they've developed, where there's these what is effectively sacred texts, which are documents that have been classified, that have been made holy by classification authorities, and elaborate rituals that people inside organizations that deal with classified documents go through in terms of their handling, social cues that occur by those people who have higher security clearances, flaunting their security clearances to others. If you like, a higher and higher order of a devoted class. And when these holy objects, documents that have been classified by a classification authority, go out to the public and are seen by the world, by the public, by profaned eyes, those documents themselves become profaned. And so those people within the national security state are not able to read them, even though they are the very people who could read them in the first place. And if they do read them, they have to self-report and cleanse. Literally, that is what it said. They have to self-report, confess, and cleanse the computer systems that they are on, and say it's not going to happen again, and so on. So these elaborate rituals developed within this state within a state, which is the 5.5 million people who have active security clearances in the United States, and on its social and political periphery. Those are the people who aspire to have security clearances, and those people who have previously had security clearances, and those people who work with people who have security clearances, and the family members of people who have security clearances. Altogether, it's something like 30 to 50 million people in the United States. So that's a large and influential chunk of the US population. So it's enough to keep bizarre cultural values circulating. Anyway, the result is that think tanks in the United States, academic journals, and so on were not able to turn their mind to what the single largest repository of US foreign policy says about what is happening with US foreign policy. So if you like, the academic layer, the academic description of the international climate is gradually laid down and gradually built up as a result of papers being published, a kind of tarmac over which we explore the world. In fact, there's a section of that is secretly carved out, which is all those papers that should have been produced but were censored as a result of this process, and is not there. And so as politicians and policymakers try and judge what to do, they actually keep falling in this hole, which is all the academic material that should have been produced but wasn't produced. But of course, the phenomena that occurs with us and which we are able to document in quite a concrete way with us simply reflects the corruption of US academia and English-speaking academia more generally in terms of its understanding of international relations because of its over-proximity to the State Department in terms of feeder schools or think tanks where people aspire to aspire to security clearances, or they have other forms of proximity to it, or they're scared about being prosecuted. And that has been going on for decades. So the description we have of the world is not the description of the world as it actually exists, because our description of the world rests significantly on what academics have been able to do and what journalists have been able to do, and enormous sections of that are opaque as a result of this kind of self-censorship. So we had to produce a book instead.
You used the word empire deliberately, and actually what it reminded me of while you were talking was, in physics you would call that a black hole or a singularity out of which nothing could possibly escape. So maybe it's fitting that the book appears to be black. It hasn't been published or hasn't been released in Australia yet. So maybe there's a lot of the analysis of WikiLeaks and the work that you do and the publishing that happens is in effect a kind of meta-narrative about the role of your organisation and your role in it in particular, and some of the other principles, and comparatively less focus on what you published and what the work actually is. So you've gone to the trouble of publishing this book, and you're using words like empire, I presume, very deliberately. What does the book tell us about how the world actually works?
Well, this word empire, it was deliberate because the US is an empire, and under a raft of descriptions about what empires are. Of course, it's not the Roman Empire. It operates differently. It's a modern empire. It does things in a much more sophisticated and nuanced manner. But the first reference to the word empire that I make in the introduction is extensively footnoted. And there's a reason for that, because outside the United States, especially in Europe, and I'm not sure about Australia, it's questioned whether the US really is an empire. It's not actually that much questioned inside the United States. So, for example, in 2002, US writer Charles Krauthammer, one of the instrumental ideological fathers of neoconservatism, observed that people were, quote, now coming out of the closet on the word empire, reflecting the unrivaled dominance of the United States culturally, economically, technologically, and militarily. Google statistics for words in books published in English over the 30-year period to 2008 show a 450% increase relative to other words of the phrase US empire. between 2000 and 2008, Google statistics for words in books published in English over a 30-year period to 2008 show a 450% increase in the phrase of US empire between 2000 and 2008, without any corresponding increase in the left-wing phrase US imperialism. On January the 5th, 2003, Sunday magazine for New York Times ran with a cover declaring, "American empire, get used to it." Even military operations are starting to adopt the word. For example, the yearly combined Anglophone, so that's Australia is included, Australia, Canada, it's basically the Five Eyes countries, Australia, US, Canada, UK, New Zealand. The yearly combined Anglophone space, air, and ground intelligence and targeting fusion exercise led by the United States, which posits an insurgent challenge to occupying Anglophone forces, is called Operation Empire Challenge. It's happened every year, and we released 2 years worth of their internal documents. But it's basically get all the intelligence agencies, including the National Security Agency and the NRO, which operates space assets, and the US Army and the US Air Force, and some equivalents from Australia, Canada, and UK, New Zealand, and get them to all interoperate with each other, which is an extremely complex logistical process. If you imagine trying to communicate all that data through all those different countries, through space assets, through fiber optic cables, through sensors that are collecting things from the ground up to planes that are flying past. And the self-description is an empire, and insurgents challenge the empire.
One of the ways in which it can be challenged, and in fact in which you and some of your allies and affiliates have challenged it, is the ability to at least communicate securely. And we've just in Australia passed, not the anniversary, but the implementation date for a national data retention scheme, even as they've started dismantling them in some European jurisdictions. Can you tell us a little bit about what you think the role of cryptography and secure communications plays and in fact, if you like, you can have a crack at answering the question that's probably been thrown at you more times than you care to remember. If people don't have anything to hide, should they bother taking those sorts of precautions? But also the role that you think that's played in your organisation or for civil society more generally.
There's actually not a very snappy rhetorical response to this question. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. It's a more nuanced response. If you think about it, actually, it is true for many people in relation to the powers that be that have access to all that surveillance information. Most people next week don't have anything to fear from that. The problem is that there's a dynamic equilibrium of different forces within a nation. We can talk about globally as well, it's a more complex picture, but within a nation, there's a dynamic equilibrium of powers. So intelligence agencies, courts, media, banking, political forces, and so on. And that dynamic equilibrium is what keeps bargaining power for individuals within society. Essentially, it is what keeps society going completely to shit, because when one actor or allied power groups within a society start making life difficult for everyone, you can instead change your allegiances, change your support in another direction. And what lubricates that whole system is information flow between people about what is happening within the society. So we might call that investigative journalism or gossip or pricing information flowing throughout the economy. That is what keeps us aware of what is actually happening and whether our interests are being compromised and whether society is going to shit. Now, there's not many journalists actually. There's not many human rights activists. There's not many politicians like Scott. But these are critical elements that keep the society in equilibrium. And if these critical elements can't function, then you have something to fear. So it's not simply about you. If I have nothing to hide, then I have nothing to fear is a very selfish statement. What about all the other actors in society who keep society healthy for you? If you eliminate their ability to operate, then you're going to live in a society that even you don't like, and frankly, live in a society that even people who work for intelligence agencies don't like. That even the elites and even the establishments won't like that society. Now, they may have short-term benefits from pushing in that direction, but even they won't like the society that we see as a result.
That's the first time I think I've heard that one answered in that way. Thank you. So I think we've got another half hour or so with you, and I was going to throw to questions because we do have a decent number of people here. And the first person who's indicated he wanted to put a question to you was Nikki. So over to you.
Hi, Julian. Nicky Hager here. Hey, I had the disappointing experience a few days ago of hearing you being interviewed in New Zealand by Radio New Zealand about the book, and you endured.
I like that.
Not for the first time, the experience of being asked many questions about the embassy, court cases, Sweden, and pretty much everything but the book. I'm sorry, can I apologise from New Zealand? Whereas I felt that the thing that I would have liked to be hearing about, or that should have been talked about, is the way that in spite of where you are, you managed to keep on being creative and coming up with new ideas and doing new things in spite of what's happened to you. And so with that in mind, I'd like to ask you what I would have liked the interviewer in New Zealand to ask you, which is, please tell us more about the book we haven't seen yet. Tell us a couple of stories from it. Tell us about what your latest achievement, please.
It's a difficult thing. This book was written because some news journalists had done a good job at producing individual stories about particular small events or corrupt actions of a particular character. Many different countries. In fact, or perhaps North Korea was the only country which didn't have a domestic story as a result of that material. But it's very easy to not see the empire for all the cables, and that fast reporting cycle and the economies of the media, let alone self-censorship, let alone reasons of self-censorship, caused a sort of profusion of stories, some very important, but which nonetheless didn't lay out any kind of structural relationships. It didn't lay out how does the US go about its role in the world, and how do other countries respond to that, and how do they interact with each other as regional entities. So, for example, one of the chapters on East Asia looks at the triangle of the United States, Japan, and South Korea, and how the US plays off the left in South Korea and Japan through the rivalries and the neuroses of each country about the other. And so that's something you want to look at, and that's not something you can do unless you read hundreds and hundreds of cables about Japan, South Korea to look at what that general relationship is. Similarly with Turkey and the Turkey, Israel, and Iran, a very important triangle which really shapes how the Middle East forms. In relation to Syria, something quite interesting occurred, which is the Syrian chapter was written before ISIS became a big deal. But we found a really quite incredible series of cables going back to 2006, which documented the United States' efforts to overthrow the Syrian government well before this uprising in late 2010, early 2011, which the United States said it was responding to. It was responding to the crackdown against the Arab Spring. In fact, it had always been trying to overthrow the Assad government, and it's been trying to do it in quite a grotesque manner, deliberately, and it says that nakedly in the cable, to increase paranoia amongst the Assad regime, to get it to, quote, overreact, to make it fear that there were coups being plotted and that there were uprisings, to promote sectarian conflict between the Shiites and the Sunnis, and also to make the government's response to transiting Islamists crossing between the Iraq and Syrian border a source of weakness for the government. So for a long time, the Assad government had seen what was then ISI, the Islamic State of Iraq, causing problems along the border, and it was responding to them. And the plan of the US government was to make the Assad government look weak because there were transiting Islamists at all, try and reduce foreign investment and from the Gulf and other regions within Syria. So a lot of, when we see these startling geopolitical events, like the rise of ISIS, actually, if you go back through the cables, you can see it's a long developed outcome where there is some kind of slow geometric growth in a phenomena. But geometric growth has a nature of always looking to the majority like it's a surprise to people who weren't watching it for a great deal of time. The book has 17 authors. I'm one. We have an anonymous author who's written 3 chapters, which are some of the best written chapters in the book, and a variety of experts, mostly from the United States, covering the different regions.
We might open the floor to questions, and there are a couple of hands all gone up. So just ask you to keep them fairly quick so that we can get through as many folk as possible.
Thanks, Julian. You're a great inspiration to all of us, and we're looking forward to seeing you having seeing a bit more sun. But very quickly, 2 things. The WikiLeaks party in Australia is using the good name of WikiLeaks and its reputation as an honest reporter, and seems to be running it into mud. So I'd invite you to talk on that. And the second thing is a more general question, is in the world today in 2015, what is the great evil that we all have an obligation to resist?
For WikiLeaks party, it's in complete dormancy for some time. There's a good question whether it should be taken out of dormancy. There is a not very good social media manager, I agree. On the other question, what we have an obligation to resist, I don't see things structured. You'll find most of the time people are always looking for popular support. I understand that. That's why it's natural when people are speaking to the public that they're trying to get support from the public. I see things differently. I think the public must have a semblance of knowledge about what is going on. Otherwise, they can't protect their own interests. But it can be delegated to someone in their family or someone amongst their friends who can be the person who has their finger on the pulse of things. But I see that there should be professional elites who have responsibilities for holding government and geopolitics to account. People like Nikki Hager and Scott are those professionals. That's what they do professionally, full-time. And you need professionals because what we have in most of the world is effectively many thousands of organized conspiracies. What do I mean by that? I don't mean Illuminati-type conspiracies. I mean people within large corporations plotting together in a manner to achieve power in a way which the public would find not to their satisfaction, would find immoral and perhaps even criminal. These complex, sophisticated conspiracies need people who are experts in penetrating complex groups, the behavior of complex groups. And the average person can't do that. they can occasionally find evidence of it and put it on social media. Occasionally that happens. And that evidence can be swept up, sometimes by the public, sometimes by people who have a professional responsibility to do that. But if you look at, say, the US or the Five Eyes Alliance and that vast intelligence apparatus which is sweeping up most of the world's communications, is it our responsibility individually to combat that? That is absurd. Of course, individually, people who are not experts can do almost nothing about that. What they can do is they can support people and organizations who have taken upon themselves a professional responsibility to do that. And that includes intelligence services. Now, unfortunately, the Australian intelligence service is almost completely co-opted by the US and UK intelligence services. But if it was acting as a proper intelligence service, it would be defending Australians from that form of mass surveillance, and would be advising them and advising Australian companies and Australian politicians and protecting them as part of its professional role. So I think if we look at the problems in the world as individuals, we must think that they're absolutely overwhelming, impossible to deal with. And it is not our task, generally speaking, as individuals, to stop that. It is our task to support elements within the population that have taken on that role as groups or professionals to oppose it, and to police, yes, but also to support those groups. And they can include they can include government departments as well. They should include government departments. There's a failure in the Australian state in that respect, unfortunately.
Yeah, g'day, Julian. My name's George. Keep fighting the good fight, mate. I just wanted to ask you, following on from that mass surveillance, recently we had another whistleblower, not as well known as Edward Snowden, but it preceded him, Thomas Drake, who you're probably familiar with, a very high-ranking NSA official who blew the whistle on mass surveillance. But he opened my eyes to something a lot of people here weren't aware of, which was the big NSA, National Security Agency facility in Utah, the data storage facility, which in the light of our current legislation with the 2 years data retention, to put it into context, he was talking about they have the capability in a building the size of 3 football fields to hold 100 years worth of data of the entire electronic communications of the world. Now that raises up the implication of having that central repository with the Five Eyes and similar agreements, that there could be backdoor means for that information to be analysed and transported and between intelligence agencies and governments, and therefore could get around what I think is the current ban that Congress has put on that, or temporary ban that has put on that NSA facility for constitutional reasons, but I think that's going to be forward. So I just wondered if you wanted to comment on these kind of big data repository systems that are being developed and how they could circumvent national boundaries and international agreements.
I know Thomas Drake very well. He's visited me several times here. He's a former manager at the National Security Agency, and he was perhaps the most significant NSA whistleblower in the 2000s. There is another one, by the way, going back to 1973, and whose statement at that time that appeared in Ramparts magazine is on WikiLeaks. Winslow, if you search for Winslow NSA WikiLeaks, you'll find it. Very, very interesting. So far ahead of its time, no one believed it. The facility in Utah, Thomas Drake's description of it is correct. But there's a broader phenomenon going on, which is that human beings, to be human, Chomsky would say, and I agree with him, is to communicate. What sets us apart from other animals and what allows us to build civilizations and to have this discourse is that we are the language animal. This is our real specialty compared to other mammals. The scale of human language has now been conquered by computation. So the human population is small in terms of human population times the amount of words each human speaks each day. But this is something that is very easily encompassed by not only by the National Security Agency, but even other organizations. If you don't want to record audio, if you don't want to record video or audio, but you just want to record the words, there's quite a number of organizations now who can record the total, in effect, intellectual output of humanity on a constant basis. And this dwarfing of the human by automation is something that us as human beings, we should feel threatened by, and we should feel considerably more threatened when we see that it is occurring in opaque, unaccountable agencies like the National Security Agency, but also the Australian ASD forming part of that process. Now, in some ways, I'm not so worried about the National Security Agency on its own. We went head-to-head with the National Security Agency in relation to Edward Snowden, using encrypted communications and some fancy footwork and speed in a well-defined contest. We managed to get him out of Hong Kong, and the National Security Agency, CIA, and all the other forces that the US government could put together in the largest worldwide manhunt. So in the largest manhunt the world has ever seen for a 1 month period, we were able to be victorious over that agency. And while I'm proud of that, and I'm proud of our people, and we have some smart guys and girls, it is actually more a reflection of my understanding, having dealt with those agencies for a long time, of their incompetence and their bureaucracy, and how you are able to outmaneuver them if you operate at speed and you use selective cryptography or cover stories to make things confusing, and you wedge them with politics and so on. That you can outmaneuver them, and that phenomena of incompetence induced by secrecy and corruption induced by secrecy is a very old story, and it's something that I find extremely comforting. I believe that the only thing that saves us as a species is the plethora of bureaucracy, incompetence, and corruption that sets into large secretive agencies. Now, there's a question whether that will continue to save us. And I'm concerned about it because of the merger between organizations like Google and the National Security Agency. So you have quite adept, competent organizations that operate on the commercial market, like Apple, Google, Facebook, and so on, that are fast and efficient. And they are that way because of the scrutiny of the market and the competition of the market and their relative openness. Now, the National Security Agency simply sticks its fangs into what Google collects and to what Facebook collects and to the smartphones, which no doubt probably 80% of this audience has, that are powered by Android, which is run by Google, and the data goes back to Google. So that relationship between the commercial sector and the intelligence agencies, I think, is very dangerous because of the efficiencies and competencies of the commercial sector. And if we try and quantify that, the PRISM program, which is the program the National Security Agency has to suck information out of the commercial sector, produced more final intelligence reports, contributed to more final intelligence reports than any other NSA source. So more than tapping undersea fiber optic cables, more than intercepting satellites, more than hacking in to other systems. Sucking out the commercial sector gave the NSA more.
On the same topic of these surveillance systems, do you think that it's ever possible or likely that in the future these systems will be, pulled back and kind of shut down, or do you think they're kind of here to stay for the foreseeable future?
Short of a very, very serious economic collapse or some strange new cult religion taking over the world, or both, no, they will not be shut down. The surveillance will increase, and it will continue to increase dramatically. There's a very simple reason for that. Computational power is doubling about every 18 months, and so is storage capacity. So for the same budget, same security budget, you're able to collect essentially twice as much as you could the year before. Sorry, twice as much as you could 18 months before. And even more than that, because the commercial sector is increasing its penetration of our lives and increasing the number of societies that it penetrates. And the security agencies stick their fangs into what the commercial sector is doing. And the commercial sector, if we go beyond collection and look at the automatic processing and automatic analysis, that is proceeding at tremendous speed, and not from the intelligence agencies, but from the commercial sector, producing various forms of artificial intelligence to mine that enormous pile of data that they have been managing to collect.
Julian, Helen Caldicott, I've got two questions. One, from the cables about Syria way back, did they indicate that because Russia has a very big naval base in Syria, that's one of the reasons they wanted to get rid of Assad? That's number one. Number two, Stephen Hawking et al. Are very worried about the computers becoming virtually autonomous within 10, 20 years, and they're actually postulating that computers themselves may be able to start a nuclear war with no human input. Would you like to comment on that?
In relation to Syrian cable, they don't say because of this naval base at Tartus that Russia has, that's why we want to overthrow the Syrian government. Cables don't tend to be written like that. Occasionally you get lucky. But the Russian base is mentioned quite a number of times in a variety of cables. So it's obviously something that is of interest to the United States. But you can look at a number of strategy statements and papers by people like Brzezinski looking at the grand area of the Middle East. And Syria is viewed, it is viewed geostrategically, it's viewed as unfinished business in relation to knocking out that last Russian base. Russia has 12 bases in the world total. The one in Syria is the only one that is outside its immediate region, say like Uzbekistan, outside what in fact were former Soviet Union countries. So it's the last unfinished business from the Cold War, knocking out that base. But there's also a very serious gas project with gas being obtained in the gas fields off the coast of Qatar. The proposed pipeline goes from Qatar to Saudi to Jordan, up through Syria and to Europe, and that competes with the Russian gas to Europe, but obviously they can't push it through Syria as long as there's a Russian-friendly government in Syria. So a lot of geostrategic games in the classical grand area, but also, and those people have kind of been studying foreign policy, have been studying geopolitics for a while, are very familiar with that. I think something more interesting has happened, which is the US allies and US, what we would have once said US puppet states in the region like Saudi, or US client states like Turkey, have developed. So Qatar, Saudi, Turkey, to a degree Jordan, have become economically, diplomatically, and militarily stronger relative to the United States than they used to be. So they have their own interests, and they are able to assert their own interests more than they could in the past. And so the US doesn't have complete control on them. So it's not right to say this is simply a US equation. The US has accepted and fostered a lot of this, but the US has also, it's also being pulled by these states, including Israel, which hopes to cement its control over the Golan Heights if there's strife in Syria, and maybe even maybe even throw up a buffer zone around the Golan Heights and get increased territory. Turkey has empirical ambitions, which it's had for a long time, to retake Syria, which it lost at the time of the First World War. So the automation, the progress towards automation, it's a serious thing. Scott mentioned it briefly in terms of wealth inequality. So a lot of the galloping wealth inequality we're seeing now is as a result of automation. To my mind, it comes from two places. Number one, when you stitch the world together, you create global markets. So when you create a global market, what happens? The market leader in what was previously the largest sub-market simply gets larger and occupies the whole market. And whoever's the shareholders and owners of that thing, they get proportionally fatter. So it's inevitable when you place individuals and companies into a larger arena, those that were already on top start to get even bigger because now they've got a larger market. But similarly, increased automation means that a company like Apple, which is now the largest company by market capitalization in the United States and overwhelmingly the most profitable company, is able to be run with something like 100,000 employees. But if you go back to what was the largest company, General Motors, in the 80s, you had about 1.5 million employees. So to create a very large profitable company, you need many fewer employees, which means you don't have to spread the wealth as much amongst the employees who still have some kind of hold over the company. In the end, they can go on strike. So they have some bargaining power within the company. So the amount of bargaining power that human beings have to force wealth redistribution is dramatically decreasing as a result of automation. And more processes within companies become automated. Stocks, stock purchases, and dividend processing of dividends becomes automated. Well, 50% of stock trades are now automated, extremely short-term trades. And there's no reason to believe that the increased automation of components of companies won't increase. Now, this essentialist view that there will be suddenly one day smart AI which will turn on and this artificial intelligence will emerge and like a kind of demonic Jesus and take over the world. I don't see things happening that way. Artificial intelligence is already here in a whole lot of ways. Once artificial intelligence back in the 60s, partly because of National Security Agency funding, was called AI and MT, artificial intelligence and machine translation. Machine translation has largely been conquered. It's been easily conquered enough for search, for example. So we're done with that part of artificial intelligence. Similarly, voice recognition is now getting reasonably good. That's another part of artificial intelligence. Chess is long ago conquered as artificial intelligence. So many different aspects of human ability are slowly being conquered. Now, it's not surprising that it comes about in that manner, because if you actually look at the brain, it's many different systems that have evolved as human beings and their ancestors have gone through life. Neural circuits have evolved to deal with those parts of life. So we have actually, the brain is many different computers, if you want to take a computer analogy. But there are many different problems in the world. Some correspond to human brains. Others, already computers do vastly better. So if you look forward, it's simply going to be increasing automation of companies in many different ways and more, for more and more sophisticated jobs. So the low-level white-collar jobs are starting to be automated out now. And that will just simply increase. And there's this quaint notion that in the end, human beings are the consumers, and the companies exist for the consumer market. That's not true. Most of the goods exchanges and financial exchanges that occur between companies, various forms of manufacturing and financial processing, and it doesn't all go in the end to contribute to the consumer market. That's an illusion. There's no need for the consumer market. There's no need in the end for the human market to exist at all. In the end, you can just have computer-controlled companies engaging with each other and with their component parts to extract resources, to get energy, and to achieve dominance over resources and energy. And so that's actually where we're going. And I'd like to point out that people inside the National Security Agency, they get off on this vision. People inside Google get off on this vision. A number of people in Google have a atheistic religious view about the world, that computers will one day be so powerful that you'll be able to upload your brains into them and then live in a kind of heaven inside the computer system. Anyone who understands anything about politics and how institutions behave will tell you immediately that that's not what computers are going to be used for. They're not going to be used to construct heavens. They're going to be used to take over other companies, to gain access to resources, to fight over resources, to merge with the military, and so on.
We've run the clock down. We've got a wrap, so I was going to throw the last brief question to John, if that's all right. Thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Good day, Julian. John here. It's a pretty bleak picture. It's day 1216. The world of information tends to centralization. And the only happy thing you've said to us, as we sit here amazed that you can carry on, is that it's incompetence and corruption induced by secrecy that gives us hope. I mean, I think a lot of us would like to ask you, what keeps you going? What keeps you going in these circumstances that are shit?
Well, it's clearly all this constant, amazing, beautiful discoveries of incompetence and corruption worldwide. There are many other hopes. The majority of the trajectory that we're on now is that trajectory. There are other hopeful things. Scott was talking about some of them. Additionally, people are inventive. There will be many unpredictable, destabilizing inventions that occur as time goes by. Then there is a decent chance of an economic collapse, which would regress the state of advancement. But I think a state where if we continue on with the same sort of computational increases and the same sort of collection arrangements that produce what is something now called in academia surveillance capitalism. Let me explain. Traditional economic theory talks about exchange of goods and supply and demand. Information doesn't obey the same equation because it's infinitely reproducible and is often created as an externality. Normally, we hear about externalities in the negative sense, such as pollution being an externality of a factory making thongs. But there are many positive forms of externalities. And when you talk to your friend over an Android phone, you are creating a positive externality for Google. You think you're just talking to your friend, but the fact that you're talking at all is information about the world, and Google harvests that and a lot of other forms of information as well. Same on Facebook, and so these positive externalities are created and collected, and then the greater computational power you have, the more you can derive from that vast captured knowledge about how the world works. And you can use that to influence people in the world and get greater access to resources and to energy. This state of artificial intelligence now and the speed that it's progressing at. I'll give you an example. Google has bought up a number of drone companies. It's also bought up a number of artificial intelligence companies, including companies who produce artificial intelligence software that is very good at playing war games, learning how to play war games automatically. Google has, it also bought a mapping company, which cooperates with the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, which is the US spy satellite agency. And that's where Google Maps comes from. It also has Google Street View, which it added into that. So it has an understanding of what the geography of the world is, what the streets are of the world. Also where the people are, because all you idiots are carrying these Android phones. So it knows where the people are, it knows where the streets are, it knows where the houses are, it knows what the terrain is, it knows where the internet services are, the various computers that are sending things to the internet. And it knows what people are interested in, more or less. And so then if you have drones as well, you can start running the drones down these streets. You've got all the maps, you know where all the people are. Now, of course, to begin with, those will be postal drones that are conveying goods to people and between companies and ultimately between computer control companies. But if the natives get restless, these drone companies Google has purchased also produce military drones. And Google has a number of contracts with the US military, including in relation to those maps. So if a state starts to cause some problem, you can bet a Google-produced drone controlled by the US military will be running down the street using Google Maps, knocking at your door. They'll know it's you because you have an Android phone. That's where inevitably where we're going, unless there is a destabilizing force. And I'm not sure talking about it is enough of a destabilizing force. I hope it is enough of a destabilizing force, but I'm not sure it is. So what keeps me going? Well, I like a challenge. I think that's a really big challenge, and so. I mean, what else can you do? You just have to face these challenges. Intellectually, it's extremely stimulating to try and take that thing on. It's very fascinating to see how it all works. And when you have victories, as we did, for example, in this head-to-head conflict over Edward Snowden, as we did with various publications, that's also extremely pleasing, that you can actually get somewhere and you can set a positive example that inspires others.
Well, I think on behalf of the whole room, I can say you've certainly inspired a bunch of people tonight, and I very much appreciate that you've come online, and that I look forward to the day we can actually join us down here at the podium and we don't have to use this ridiculous technology. Please make your appreciation for Julian.
Thanks.
That's pretty good for someone who's been up all night. And I mean, he has amazing energies and powers. Scott, would you like to come back? Because I wanted sincerely to thank you for your everything I said at the beginning is confirmed. And I think it's fair to say that there are times, it hasn't happened many times in my life, when actually elected representatives give you hope. And it seems to me that you're one of them.